Um, Hello and welcome to Virtual Coffee Lunch and Learn Edition. Virtual Coffee's mission is to be a welcoming tech community that allows room for growth and mentorship at all levels and to create meaningful opportunities for learning, leadership, and contribution for everyone. To find our code of conduct, our events, or just to learn more, you can always check out our website, virtualcoffee.io. We are really glad to have you here with us today, and I especially want to thank our presenter for being here, Mr. Dan Ott. Dan is one of my favorite people. Dan is one of the maintainers at Virtual Coffee. He's also like just pretty swell dude and extremely knowledgeable, in my opinion, of the front end developer space. Dan describes himself as an independent front end designer and developer, a father, ADHD person, and a Clevelander. And Dan is going to be here to talk to us all about Next.js. Next is probably something you've heard about in the JavaScript ecosystem. It has really picked up pace in the last few years, and it's become like one of the major platforms for delivering performant, usable web applications. So Dan hopefully can leave us a little bit smarter than we came in. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to him. He's going to take it away.
All right, y'all. Thank you, Kirk. Thanks for that. I really should update that bio sometime, but what are you going to do? Yeah, like Kirk said, I'm Dan. I obviously maintainer here at Virtual Coffee and been doing JavaScript front end, lots of pretty much everything for a really long time. So just a short history of like my experience with React, right? So I've been writing JavaScript since I started doing website stuff, but it was hard. JavaScript was hard for a long time. You had to, I was writing JavaScript before jQuery even came out, and jQuery. So before any of that, you had to do a lot of stuff very manually. You had to make sure you're handling all the browser situations. You had to make sure that you are like, it's just very fiddly, easy to break. There was no package managers, anything like that. jQuery came out and became a little easier to do a lot of things, especially the big thing that jQuery enabled was it was called Ajax back then, which stands for asynchronous JavaScript something and XML. I don't remember what it stands for. I should have looked that one up. But this was like a big turn, right? And so what that let you do is do things like pull in data fetches on the client side without doing a full page request. So before that, if you had a dynamic site, that means by dynamic site, I mean sites with live data or searches or databases behind them, anything like that. Your only choice was to get a full page refresh anytime you navigated or searched or did anything like that, right? And so that was, it worked, but it wasn't always the best, it wasn't always the best like experience. It wasn't always, it was, and it's also sort of hard to manage. And so Ajax let us do make some things like a lot nicer, right? You could do a search without refreshing the page. You could load the next little thumbnail. You could, do all sorts of stuff, right? And what happened, the problems with that is that if people had trouble with JavaScript for many reasons, and I'm not going to dig too deep into like why you could have problems with JavaScript. There's a lot of reasons why, but if you didn't handle it in a way that would also work without JavaScript, your site would break, right? And so sometimes that's fine if it's just like extra functionality. Sometimes that's not great at all if it's real functionality, right? If you have a shopping cart or something that depends on JavaScript didn't run, or it broke, or there's a bug, or I don't know, lots of different reasons, right? Your site would be super broken. There's like, I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of history, but React came out a while after that, and what React let you do, all right, so I'm sorry, so the Ajax stuff with jQuery was very cool, but it was still like a pain to do interactive things wherein you're changing things as people see it, right? And so if you were in jQuery land and made a request, you'd have to get that request and then like find the DOM nodes in JavaScript and manually replace them, and you have to make sure you replace them with the right elements and the right class names or whatever, the right styles. And that was a pain. And so React, what that did is introduced a new sort of paradigm for this sort of thing, where when the UI changes, instead of the developer like having to manually make sure we change everything, you know, React reacts to things, right? And so if a state change happens, or an interactive thing happens, you know, if you've written your components correctly, the components, the output that the user sees updates on its own, which is really, really nice. But for a very long time, React still had the same problem that I was describing before, where it was dependent on JavaScript running in the browser, right? Another downside of things being dependent on JavaScript is it increases the page load size, right? So you have to, when a user loads your web page, they download the content of the web page, and then if there's script tags and things like that, the browser also has to download those. And there is an amount of time where that's happening and the user still can't interact with the page. And that's a problem. And then also the problems with if things break or if people don't have JavaScript turned on, or there's like the Facebook, I forget what it's called, the Facebook like OG web crawler, the thing that gets like the previews and the like cards, and same with the Twitter one. Those things don't run JavaScript. And so if your content is dependent on JavaScript, the like search engines aren't going to see that content. Some of that has changed like more recently. I know the Google web crawler at least tries to, you know, execute some amount of JavaScript, but if it doesn't happen quickly, it's probably not going to get it. So like where am I? Yeah. So that's kind of like React, you know, at that point. And so that was, I don't know, 10 years ago. I don't really, somebody can put in the chat. I don't remember when React was released, but you know, it was a while ago, and they've obviously been working on it very hard since then. So another complication with React is it's written in a language called JSX language. I'm not sure if that's the right term for it, but JSX is a language that's kind of on top of JavaScript, and it has things like you have things like HTML in the in your here, let me start sharing here. So there we go. So what is JSX? Okay, so here's this is the old React doc sites. I'll get there in a second, but JSX looks like this. All right, and so you have things that look like HTML inside your JavaScript. And it's really awesome. And this lets us do all of our interactive things with state and everything like that. The problem is that browsers don't understand JSX, right? And so you need to run your React code through something called a transpiler back in the day, or well, still currently in lots of cases, that would basically take this stuff and then transform it into JavaScript that the browser can read. And that is kind of tough to navigate. It's tough to keep on top of, and it's tough to hook up. So if anybody's ever like done, almost 10 years to date. Thank you, Kurt. There's a package called Webpack that is like very complicated and very cool and does a lot of things, but it's incredibly hard to set up and finicky and all that stuff. So React released create React app. Let's see here, React app. And this was a pretty cool thing that had all that Webpack stuff built in. So you could start up a Create React app and start writing React, and then hit build or whatever, and it would build your app for you. That's pretty cool. The problem with that situation is that everything that Create React app outputs runs only on the client side, right? And so so what these creates is single page apps, which you've probably heard that term. It's often referred to as SPAs. But what that means is the code that is like loaded on your browser, like when you download the HTML, it's, originally it's just an empty div tag, right? And then all of this JavaScript would run and insert it all into the div tag. Worked pretty great, but lots of downsides, all the stuff that I keep talking about, bundle size, brittle to errors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With Create React app, you can install some extra packages like a React router, things like that. You can have a page that has links, things like that. You could even like link to them externally. So you could do a lot of stuff, but it was not always very ideal. And you see people complaining about the bundle sizes, and basically that means like the size of all of the JavaScript that you have to download to run a Create React app is large. And so after that, came some extra meta frameworks, right? And so they call them React frameworks. We used to like people used to refer to them as meta frameworks, but there's React app, React is a JavaScript framework, and then there are now frameworks that are built on top of React that let you build React applications. And so I guess they call them React frameworks now. We used to call them meta frameworks, but so Next.js is one of them, right? And so this is the React framework for the web. That's what they say. Next.js is a partner with React, so they work like with the React team, which is really cool. I don't know. I suppose there's some downsides where I think that they get some inside knowledge, things like that. But that's all right. I'm not going to get into the politics of things right now. Other React frameworks that exist in the same kind of sphere. So Remix. Remix is a pretty cool. Let me get to the like actual homepage. Remix is another framework that came out a couple years ago, written by the guys that did React Router, and it's very cool as well. So Remix had some of the first like times that I saw a lot of the stuff that this new app router uses was in Remix, and I think that Next.js used some of that for inspiration and did some cool stuff with it. Another one you've probably heard of is Gatsby. So Gatsby is another React framework. Gatsby, I haven't like dug into what Gatsby does currently. The last time I used it was a couple years ago, but what Gatsby did was it would take React components and whatever you gave it, and you could do API requests and things like that, but it would output a full static site. So every single HTML, every single route like that you have, and I'm sure this is built in Gatsby, right? And so this is like, why Gatsby? And this page, if you view the source, is full HTML, all this HTML exists, right? And then it puts React on top of it, so you can do React stuff. Remix and Next.js are more considered full stack frameworks, right? And so what that means is, in this situation, is that there's code that runs on the server, not at build time. And so when you are deploying an app like this, there's a build step that happens. I mean, it could happen on your server, it could happen in a GitHub action, it could happen on your machine. And then the build step outputs some code that you run, that you like upload to the server in some way. And in Gatsby, the build step is the output of the build step is all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, all static files. So you could host a Gatsby site on like literally anywhere that can host a page. You can host it on Amazon S3. You could host it on GitHub Pages. You could host it on Netlify, of course, and lots of other places. But the output of this was a static site, right? Remix and Next.js both. I don't want to say anything about Remix, but Next.js certainly allows you to do that, right? And so you can, in Remix, in Next.js, you can, let's get to the deploying. So you can deploy a static HTML export, just like we did with Create React App, like we did with Gatsby. You can export HTML and CSS and JavaScript files that have no server-side rendering once you get to the server. That's great if there's no dynamic data, or if the dynamic data is only needed to be read at build time. The problem comes when you want to be able to interact with things, right? So if you have, again, like a search or a database or an API that you want to be both up to date and possibly react to changes, things like that, you need to do something on the server. And so before we had full stack apps, what you do is your React code would, download some sort of library and make a fetch call on the client. And this is all happening on the client side, that's the browser, and on the user's browser, right? And then, and then do its stuff with it, whatever it needs to do, show the blog posts, show the search results, whatever. What this lets you do is when you do a full stack hosting, right? As opposed to static hosting, you can take advantage of the server making requests for you, which is pretty nice. So you can do things like make API requests that have API, secret API keys, right? You wouldn't want to bundle those with your client side thing because people could look at them. And so this makes it a lot easier. Both React and both Next.js and Remix allow you to do that pretty easily. And there's a lot of other advantages too. So we have pages and all that stuff. And the way that Next.js, and I'm going to get into like the way that it actually renders on the server and everything. But the idea here is that a Next.js app is really, really good for basically anything where you want to write React. You can get away with a lot of stuff without downloading very much to the browser, and only the things that you need, right? So if you are planning on writing an application, if you're starting from scratch, or if you want to start, they have some notes in here about, well, here, sorry, this is the, and I'll share all these links later, but where did my, yeah, all right, so this is the React docs, right? These are the new React docs. If you haven't seen these before, they are awesome. React got a bad rep for having bad docs, and which was, I think, justified, but nowadays they redid these. So that's like a side note, but the React docs are really, really good. And on the React docs site, they have a bunch of different ways for getting started and starting a new one. So if you're going to start from scratch, adding React to an existing project, things like that. So there's lots of different ways you can go about it. And they have some links to other frameworks here, excuse me, besides Next.js. So I'd encourage you to do some more reading there if you like. But today I am talking about Next.js. Do we have any questions like so far? I know I'm just kind of like running through a bunch of stuff. I'm going to dig into the actually using Next.js next, but just want to check in, see if we have any questions. Yeah, Kirk, go ahead.
So far, so good. A quick question based on what we just saw on that site. Has the Create React app been deprecated as like React's official intro to the ecosystem?
Yes, yeah, it has. That's a good question, and it has, absolutely. There is on the React docs, the new ones, there is no mention of it anywhere. They don't even mention, like, in the part where they are talking about different ways to, let me see if I could find this React anywhere. Yeah. So like this is where like you might want to use Create React app or something, like, right, inserting it into pages or different things. They don't mention it even one bit. And I think that they broke it off and somebody else besides React is managing it now. I'm not totally sure about that, but certainly like they do not mention Create React. Like that used to be on the old doc site. That was like the first thing you did on all their tutorials. Now it's generally, honestly, it's Next.js on theirs for when they're doing tutorials that involve actually like, yeah. So this is their like start a new React project, and this is your first command, create next app. So that creates a Next.js app. And this used to be create React app. And they have, Remix and all this stuff have these same things too. But yeah, so that's a good question. And yeah, for all the reasons I said, Create React app is really, it's unnecessary now, and it has a lot of downsides. So you can do still, like, if you just want to do like a one page, like literally one page, whatever, but you want it to be in React, you can do that in Next.js, and it will still be smaller than Create React app, but the output was. So yeah, good question. Did that satisfy you? Okay, cool. And Kirk, just for the future, if I ask if there's any questions and I have a pause, I don't always have the camera view. So if you have your hand raised, you can just jump in.
Okay, cool.
Or you can call in the people that have their hands raised. That'll work too, if anybody does. All right, cool. So I created some examples and things like that to dig into this. This is, I'll put this in the chat, Haruni, if I can find it. So here's our examples that we're going to be walking through. They are all here. So to get started with Next.js, they have this command, create next app, and it asks you some questions, things like that, but it basically just downloads all the packages that we need and installs them and sets up some basic configuration. This example was built on top of that. Like this README is just like the default one that they put in there. And then all I did was I didn't change, I used all the defaults. I didn't change any of the config stuff. I just added pages to it. And feel free to, pull that down and run it on your own machine if you'd like to kind of tag along. I can make this bigger. And I broke this into some steps. And so there's pull requests for each step. So, there's the base one and I'll go through everything, and there's pull requests for each like section of this talk. And you can kind of go in there and see the things that changed. So hopefully that works out okay. And I have these branches. I have all the stuff down locally, so I'm not going to try to like run create next app on the call. I've ran into that before. It's usually not a good idea. So I have it installed and I have it running. So basically, when you create a next app, so all right, yeah, let me do a little in the past, right? So in the past in Next.js, before app router, which is app router is really the thing I want to talk about here, but there was the default way, the normal way, the only way was, they called it the pages router. Okay, and so in the pages router, you had your routing was set up. Let me see if there's I had plans to make a whole big example of using the pages router, and I did not get there. Let me see if there's just no, sorry. So basically you had a directory called pages, and then in there you could create a page called about.js, and that would make a URL called about, right? And then you can return some content. There's going to be a lot of like upsides and downsides that I don't want to super get into right now, but one of the tricky things about pages, right, is that there's no concept of layouts, right? So you could have in the pages router, you could add some global content that like wrapped everything, which is fine. But within pages, you can't share layouts. And so what you'd have to do is what you have to do is create a layout component, sort of, and import it in every single page and hopefully it's up to date, everything like that. Basically the page had to return everything that wasn't global. And so if you had a page, if you had nested pages down here, create about contact or something like that, you'd have to pass around all of the layout stuff. You have to redo all the breadcrumbs, everything like that. You could do dynamic routes, which is cool. And that is pretty much the same or very similar to the app router. Yeah, here's their layout pattern. So you can see here, the layout is in components, right? So this is not in part of the router at all. And so your page would import this layout and then stick some stuff in there. The way that you did, sorry, rendering, yes. So there's a few different ways to render. So server-side render is kind of oh no, that's not the default. The default is static rendering for Next.js pages, right? And then if you wanted to get dynamic data, what you'd have to do, there's a few ways to do it. One way you can do it is server-side rendering, which this means this runs on the server, get server-side props, and you make a fetch call and then do whatever you need to do and then return it to your page as a prop, right? Data. Everything that was in here has to be goes over the network. So you can't pass functions or anything that's not serializable. Did I say that right? Serializable, which basically means what they're doing here is saying JSON to string and then returning it on the other side and then parsing it on the other side. Static site generation. So here you could make API calls, things like that. But this happens at the build time, right? And so this was really nice for a lot of sites that were, blog sites, things like that. They're not super dynamic or don't change very often. But at build time, you can make this API call to your CMS or whatever, and then build out and then export the return in the static in the returned document. They had some other nice features about refreshing caches and things like that. I'm not going to dig into deep to that right now, but that's basically that. And so what server-side rendering means well, everywhere, server-side rendering here with React. So what this means is what happens when something is server-side rendered is the React engine renders the output of your component. So this is your component. Let's say you had a page down here that used these server-side props, right? It would render the output of that component as a string, right? And on the server, and then send it to the HTML and send it to the browser, and the browser would show that content right away. But the problem is at that point, there's no, you still can't interact with anything. Like the JavaScript hasn't run, nothing has run. And so what React does is, so you'll get that content. So if you view source on a server-side render page, the content is there, right? But then React, the browser is pulling down all this JavaScript, and then the JavaScript takes over that content and basically replaces it with another render of the content on the client side, right? And that's called hydrating, right? And so you can read more about that. It's a little complex, but basically like this is really cool. This was a really cool step, a big step for everybody because it got some content to the other side. But it's still not like super ideal because there's a lot of steps and the bundle sizes are still very large. You're basically like getting all the content twice because you need to have the initial data and then like it needs to reload the data and re-render it on top. And so that's what happens with server-side rendering. Client-side rendering means this page is a work in progress. Great job, guys. Client-side rendering in the pages context means anything that like loads after the browser loads. So if you have a use effect that runs an API request or whatever, that's all in the client side, and that's client-side rendering. So the app router is sort of a very different paradigm. You can still do all the things that you can do on the pages router. You can do a lot. You can do more things probably, and the experience is a lot better because what the app router does is, or what the app router is based on is React server components. Okay, and so this is kind of a big deal. And it was in beta for a long time, and now at Next.js they've made it, I don't know, what's the opposite of beta? Production? I don't know, whatever. They've made it official in React 13.4 or something, came out a month or two ago. And so in server components, basically what happens is the whole component is rendered on the server, and there's no hydration step. There's no, what else is there? No, I don't know. All right. But like what can happen here is if you have a server component, you can have fetch calls and things like that to happen only on the server. And then the output of those fetch calls is returned to the browser. But it is not hydrated, and it doesn't happen on the client side at all, right? Another thing, one of the consequences of that is that server components cannot have any interactivity at all, right? And this is why it's fast. So you can't have in a server component, you can't have a button that has a click handler. You can't have a use state, anything, right? Because the server needs to be able to render it without the user being around. And so in the app router, there's server components and there's client components. And I'm going to dig into our code here in a second, but the idea here is that server components are just rendered entirely as they are and then sent to the server as HTML. Client components are server-side rendered just like pages used to be, but they can be just pieces of the application. So let me see if I can get this. I don't know if we can see this, right? But so this is like an app with a nav bar and a sidebar and a page, things like that. And you can see these pink ones are server components and these blue ones are client components. And so all of this pink stuff here was rendered entirely on the server and does not require JavaScript to interact with, to scroll, to look at. And then the things in blue are client components, and they are rendered they are done in server-side rendering. So that is that model that I was talking about, where it's pre-rendered on the server and then sent to the browser and hydrated with the data, and like everything happens. And so that server-side rendering isn't like evil, and it's not bad, but the less that we can, the less we can do of it, the better. And so this is kind of their diagram, and their docs are very, very good. I would encourage everybody to check them out. But yeah, so let's dive into some code. Let's dive into some code here, and we can check some things out. Yeah, what's up, Greg?
Just before we dive into the code, so just to establish, we talked about this a little bit, like, so the general flow of the app is you have these server-side components that do not require interactivity from the user. And then exactly where you need interactivity from your user, you have these client-side components. You just like make it clear to everyone, like the consequences, like you can't put like a client-side component can't have a server-side component. Like it can't be server-side anymore if it's part of a client-side component, right?
No, actually, so you can nest server-side components inside client components, but they have to be passed as props, right? So it's not like nesting. It's so it looks like nesting, but yeah, I know that's a good question. And so let me see if there's a good little composing client. All right, here we go. Nesting. Well, I have some examples of this too, but like you can pass a server component. All right, so this one will not work. Okay, so this one will. Okay, so this is the way that you do this, right? And so this is your client component, right? And let's say, okay, this is an example client component, and you have your state and everything, and then you have a prop called children, and you could make this prop called anything, right? Children is a good one because then you can just use this like a React component that you expect, where you down here use this, right? So that basically creates a boundary. So you can't, up here, you cannot import a server component into a client component, right? Because this function needs to be able to run on the browser. It runs on the server initially also, but it runs on the browser. And your server component will, like, is supposed to never ever run on the client at all, only on the server. And so this pattern lets you, well, there's the thing. Yeah, and this pattern lets you basically compose them together, right? So page is a server component. Page imports this client component and this server component, and then wraps this client server component in this client component. This is how you do things like context, right? So if you have providers, things like that, those are all client components because context is like a piece of state. So like React context doesn't work on server components, but this is how you do it. So you import a client component that has the context. So like imagine this is your theme provider, right? This is your theme provider, and then this is like another thing, right? The classic example of that, and I'll show you this I can just show you this right now. So, well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but so in your app router, you have page and layout are both server components, right? Layout can, and both of these can import client components and then and also do server components. And so your layout has like this children prop, excuse me. But in here you can put all the client components you want, right? And so if you had some theme provider, you could wrap your whole app in that theme provider, and the pages down below are all server components. And so they're still nested in. They get rendered individually and on the server and then composed together. And this allows the server to do things like streaming, which is really dope, out of the context of this talk, but a lot of things that aren't possible with like traditional server-side rendering. Does that answer your question a little bit? I know it's kind of a dicey topic, but
no, yeah, I think it makes sense. But like the core sort of, you can't just like import them, because that would imply like they would have to be run in the browser, but you can pass them in as props. So that's totally fine.
Yeah, and right, exactly. So that creates a boundary between the two. I see Aaron's asking relay component. Yeah. So it's a good question. It's a server component, and I'm gonna like dive into that right now. So the general layout of a, is this big enough? Should I make it a little bigger? I'll make it bigger. The general layout of Next.js app, right? So you have, these are, all your config files, all the stuff was installed by that create next app for me. This next directory is an ignored thing that, it uses for its runtime. And then you have the app directory, which has basically all your pages. Inside the app directory, you have a set of special file names that Next.js uses. And if you, so they are these, right? So, well, this is like .js or TSX or whatever, or JSX probably, I don't know. But it's basically error layout loading, not found page route. There's a couple other ones that I don't need to talk about right now, but in the app router, anything that is one of these file names, the app router is going to try to use to generate UI, right? And the app router will ignore every single other file. So that lets you collocate other files within your routes that don't get like caught as pages or things like that, which is really nice too. And so every single one of these is a server component, except for error is not. Error needs to be a client component. But these ones, so layout, loading, not found page, and route are all server components by default, but not by default, by always. They always are. And then these ones can import server components or client components, just like we were saying, to use it. So in your page, so like when you do a page, you return whatever HTML you want, right? And then layout is something that wraps everything that's within this route group in whatever you give it. And so this is called global layout, right? Because this is like at the top level. And so this thing has our HTML tag. Next.js will do head content for you, but with meta and stuff, but you can add a head here, a head element if you want to add some special stuff. You can do your header and footer. Children is the content, so anything that is below, so page and then any subfolders will go inside here. And let me, yeah, here's this app. All right, so this is this app running. So basically, I ran. Let me make sure that I actually ran it. Yeah, I ran next dev. So that's how you kind of, or well, pm dev, and that's how you run your local dev server. And so this is going to be like your dev server is pretty cool. It has, a lot of the normal stuff where things reload when you change things. It does API calls if you're making API calls, everything like that. And so this is our homepage, right? I have some links here and our and so one thing is, so I added this time. So some of this stuff is a little hard to illustrate in the dev environment because some of the caching things that happen don't happen the same way in dev environment. But one thing I wanted to note is, so layouts are very powerful in that anything below the layout, like anything inside children, when that changes, the layout does not re-render at all. And so you can see this every time. So I'm hitting refresh, you can't see that, but every time I hit refresh, you can see the time changing. But when I start clicking around here, did the time change? It probably did because these pages aren't rendered yet. No, yeah, cool. So every time I click around here, you can see that the time there in this layout, and this coming from the layout, is not changing, which is really powerful, and it makes it more performant and everything like that. Where am I? Okay, cool. And so one of the things we wanted to do here was, actually, let's go to the interactive thing. So on our interactive page, I have this spin me button, right? And you click it and it spins, which is entertaining. And I lost a couple hours just sitting here spinning it. But this is an example of an interactive situation that you need to do a client component, right? And so this is X page, right? So this is like don't do this. but this is a server components, this is a page, and on click, it won't work. And when you build it, it'll throw an error. And because the server doesn't know about the state of anything. So if you want to have any interactivity at all, you need to use a client component. And so in our page, in our real page, that's what I did, right? So instead of having a button that has on click and having state inside here, I imported a component called button that we made right here. And so the way that you tell the browser or the server that you have a client component is using this use client statement at the top. This is required to call it, for this, so the server knows it's client component. And then everything after that is kind of a normal looking React situation, right? So I have use state. I have, this little state thing that basically just flips it back and forth. The on click set is, if it's false, set it true, et cetera, and swapping in a class name, whether it's spun or not. So it's a simple component, but this lets us, like, this illustrates the way that we can do these client components inside a server component. So it takes a minute to wrap your head around the differences and things like that. It took me a minute anyway. But once you do it, it actually starts feeling pretty natural. So when you're building your app, you want to identify anything that can possibly be not interactive, can probably be a server component. Another situation, another place where we're using a client component in here is the breadcrumbs, right? So breadcrumbs that's our breadcrumb situation here, and you can kind of see it loading our different crumbs based on the thing. And we're making use of a hook that Next makes called use selected layout segments, and we don't need to get into how much works too much, but what it does is basically like, we are looking at this sauce page, right? And so every single folder makes a layout segment. And so it's going up the tree and saying, oh, which one are we using? And then returning it as a list. Unfortunately, like this layout segments doesn't return the name of the page or anything like that. So, I mean, I just have it returning this is basically just the URL segments, but I can also like do, it lets us know which one is the current one. And this needs to be a client component because, like we said before, this layout component does not re-render when you are navigating inside of it, and unless you import a client component that does. And then when you do that, only this part re-renders. So this is our breadcrumbs right here, and only this part re-renders when things change. The rest of this still stays the same, which is really handy. So let me see what else is in here. So our folder structure, we have, just different pages. I just kind of like nested some stuff around. You can kind of see them. And it's all kind of the same. And you can see while we're clicking around, our breadcrumb is changing, but our time clock thing that is, is in a normal React app, this would be re-rendering every time. And so this is like let me see this is setting, new date, right? This is right inside the React, the React code. And if this was in a normal client side component, and actually like we can do that here. So what the easiest way to do this is, I'm just gonna do this. So if we stick this in here, we should be able to see it re-rendering 35, about 37. Yeah. So you can see the time changing here as we navigate, because every time it re-renders, it's reloading this time, but this one is staying the same. And I don't know, I think that's kind of it's a very nice feature. And also the fact that it's not re-rendering means there's not a whole bunch of JavaScript that's like paying attention to this thing. Like JavaScript is basically ignoring this whole thing until if it was a nested layout, then if we navigated away and back, it would re-render. But yeah. And so you can have, speaking of nested layouts, you can have nested layouts. And so our awesome layout, hopefully, yes, awesome things happening. And so, right, making sure that this is working right. Okay, cool. When we're in our awesome things happening section, And this is how you do nice layouts. And so this one will say anything that's under this, at this URL or under, use this layout. And so this wraps the global, it'll nest down. So global layout, and then this layout, and then the page, right? And so this is our nice nested layout. It's basically just adding this bar. We can see if we go to a different one, that bar is not there. If we go back, it's there. Can you put a server component into the client component that shows? You mean like, can I try to do it? Sure, I can try to do that. Let's do that. When I don't even get through half my talk, Aaron, this is why. Just kidding. It's because I didn't, cut it down at all. Okay, so we're gonna do this, breadcrumbs. So instead of that, we're gonna do children. Okay, and so this is our pattern that we talked about before. So you have a client component, we have a prop called children, and then in our layout, we're gonna do, let's see, hopefully this works like I think it's gonna work. I have read about, I've read about this, but I haven't actually tried it. Although like I've tried it. I haven't tried it with my own little components. So let's check this out. All right, so now we have, sorry, I'm just refreshing to make sure we're in good shape. Yeah, so 12:56:09. This is another problem with using time for me for this. So you can see it re-rendering here because these pages weren't built yet on the dev server. And so this is one of those things where when you run, if you do a build and run like the built one, it should like work. I'm just like preloading all these. All right, there we go. So let's see, 12:56:32. There we go. And so now it is staying static because this thing is rendered on the server. You wouldn't have to go click through all that stuff if it was a built one, but the dev server, builds things on demand, things like that. Aaron, is that satisfying? Server components can be put through props. Yes, yeah, through props. And so so this creates a boundary between server components and client components. And that's how you pull it off. So any other questions on basic, very basic routing? I'm gonna move on, but Kirk, just interrupt me if somebody has a question. All right. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's relevant for now. I was just thinking, like, is there any sort of like, do you ever hit a performance trade-off if you sort of replace like one server side thing of like, or like one big client side of like a server side that's got like 17 different like client side things in it? I don't know if that's necessarily relevant. It was just something that's like bouncing around in my head. Like, is there like a cost penalty to like having multiple individual client side components versus,
Maybe. But yeah, I don't know. There might be, but I can't think of like a good reason to do that off the top of my head. Although if you have a good example in your head already, like please share it. The reason I said that is I think that I would end up, if I was in that situation, I feel like it would be a contained thing, and I'd probably just make the whole thing a client component, like right. I wouldn't, you know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there is a performance impact or not of that versus like one big client component or many small client components. And the other piece of this is I wanted to hit this real quick. The link component that comes, this is just straight from Next.js. This is perfectly good on server-side components. And the output of this is a tag, with the correct link. So if we, hopefully this will work. This is always kind of weird in the dev server, but here's our a tag, right? And it just like looks like a normal a tag. So this will work without JavaScript, everything like that. But when the link tag is present, one thing it does is this is what actually does our client side routing, right? And so if I turn JavaScript off, I could still navigate to all these pages. They'd be full page refreshes, just as if I had exported this not using React at all, right? But when these links are on the page, Next.js will go and prefetch this content. It will, and there's some fancy things you can do down that road as well. But it'll like by default go and prefetch these things if it can, if it can know anything about them, and then obviously enables the client-side router. So now I'm clicking around, I'm not doing full page refreshes, not re-rendering things, et cetera, et cetera. So the link router is your like first base for interactivity. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to pop up to our next example. So this is groups and dynamic. And so what this lets us, and sometimes when I switch branches, the dev server has a problem. And so another thing that you can do is, so we talked about nested layouts. Sometimes you want to have a nested layout for some sections, but not add a segment to the URL. So imagine if you had some auth pages that had their own UI, like login page, right? A login, edit profile, but your main app was like a totally different thing. Instead of nesting all those in a folder called auth stuff or whatever, you can nest them in a folder with these parentheses, and that creates a lot of the route segment stuff that we have, including like the ability to use nested layouts, things like that, but does not add a segment to the oops, not 2 slashes. We're gonna have to let Next.js dev server reload here again. Okay, cool. Maybe. Okay, so this is inside awesome. I moved these 2 routes to this bouncing thing, and the bouncing thing has its own little extra animation. And if I go to sauce here, once it loads these pages, the content bounces. Okay, it's really fun. And totally awesome bounces as well. But awesome mix does not bounce. Right. And so that's like one way to do these, to add some custom layout stuff to certain segments. You can also do this at the top level. So like the example I was talking about where you have a login route and some other routes, you can do this at the top level. Instead of having a root layout, you can have some routes in auth, and some route like parentheses auth, and some routes in parentheses app, or not app probably, but that'd be confusing. But parentheses full pages, I guess, I don't know. And have different layouts. You also like layouts of server components, and so you can, we'll get to this in a minute, but you can do async stuff. Like the layout components can be async, and so you can do authorization in a layout, for instance. You can do loading, you can load a bunch of content here and stick it in the header, all sorts of stuff. And so layouts are very powerful, and the fact that you can nest them, and also nest them without adding, adding things to the URI here, lets you do it. That's kind of a small feature. The other one is, so before I had volume 1 and volume 2 as routes, and now we have this just one page for the volumes, right? And so the volumes are 1 and 2 and whatever. And so you can, this is how you do dynamic parameters, right? And so this is a very like normal thing. If you see a page with a URI or a UUID or a ID or whatever /X in the URL, that needs to be read by the server. And this is how you do this. So wrapping a folder name in brackets means this can be basically anything, and then your pages below that can read the dynamic segment. And so those get passed as parameters in your page function. And our parameter here is file num, right? It matches the name that you gave the folder. And so this page, volume 1, awesome mix volume 2, awesome mix volume forget if I put a funny example on this. Yeah, it's loading. Is it loading? No, I just didn't change them. Stupid. I didn't change the link in the layout. So so we can do 3, 4, 5, right? And it'll pull them. And so if this was a blog post or something like that, you could grab this ID and go fetch the blog post content, things like that. And these can be nested as well. Obviously, if you want, you could have a whole bunch of parameters down. So, awesome mix 2, 3, 4 / track / 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's how you do dynamic parameters. And then the same way you can, so I guess I didn't really check in on this, but your metadata, so this is like what makes the title, right? In a normal page, you can just export it as a constant title. If you have dynamic data, you can grab it from here. So you can build a function that returns the metadata. And so this is saying, okay, awesome mix volume, and what is the volume number? Parameters. So you can also make fetch requests in here, things like that. But you can see our title here is the correct title. Yeah, Euron mentioned SvelteKit. I just have no experience with SvelteKit at all. I've heard it's good. I'm definitely not going to be getting into this versus not other other non-React things. But I know that they took inspiration from a lot of people, and that's what everybody should do, right? Making the best product and all that stuff. And yeah, the routing, I love the routing in here. The pages router, the file names made the routes, right? Folders and file names, but it was kind of like hard to figure out exactly what was happening. And this is pretty nice. All right. I'm going to move on to error handling. Okay, cool. So another, we looked at that list of special files. So one of them is, so there's special files involved in errors and also like a general error of like if your page is not found, right? If it's 404. And so you can add special files to the app to render different error situations, and you can do those at different segments, right? And so what that lets us do, so so there's global ones, right? So if I have a 404 in general, it's going to like load this thing. And so let me see, this will work. I restarted it, right? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So this is my 404 page, right? And you can see that this, oh yeah, look at that default. But you can see that this 404 page still renders inside my global layout, which is nice. So we don't like lose everything. We don't have to redo everything. There's also global error, and the global error is, so I'm going to get into like the error handler inside routes. But this thing is, so anything that is uncaught should get caught by this thing. And because of that, and because there could be an error in your layout file, this one does have to include like the whole shebang. But errors, the error files are the only like special ones that are client components. I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember why, but they are. And they get past the error that was thrown. And on server-side errors, well, I'll dig into this in a second, but server-side errors are handled a little bit differently, but this thing will still catch them. And so if we go into error here, so the most basic way to do this is, or like one of the things you want to catch is like client-side errors, right? Errors that happen in the runtime. And so this button is just like an on-click that throws an error. And here is my error. And so this is all this, like this, and all the action that's happening over here is a dev server stuff. Like this is never going to show up in production, but this does, right? And so to display that, we have an error component here. And it gets our error and lets us return something. And you can see that this app, so let me reload this page. So this is like my danger zone layout, right? And this is my danger zone page. Okay. So I throw an error, the error state gets rendered inside the layout, which is also really nice. You don't lose your navigation. And if I had a route that was just like this tiny little thing, the error would just show up in there. It also gives you this reset. This is probably why it's a client component, but it gives you this reset function that basically resets the page to the state it was before it loaded, which is also kind of handy. And then if we throw us, this might not work on the dev server as well. Oh no, it did. Yeah, cool. So this server side error is like, this is something that's throwing not on the client, but like throwing on the server. And this is just throws an error. It's like, that's all it's doing. But in this situation, so I said this message will not appear in production. So that is because, you know, errors that are thrown on the server could have details that you don't want to get out. And so Next.js will sort of abstract this stuff and just return a generic message that says there was a error in your app or something like that. And then a digest number that you can go and look in your server logs. So that protects you from exposing things through errors, which is also pretty cool. And the other kind of like error that could happen is 404. So if your page is not found, or if you, let's say you are making a blog post, you know, request, and that request is not found, you can return a not found in your page. And this is our, excuse me, and you can create a special not found file. That's because lots of times when it's not found, you don't want to throw a big scary error. You want to be helpful or something. And so you can do a separate one that does that situation. And these are also co-located in the props. And so if so that you can see here, this is danger not found. This is like my special danger zone error 404, but in my like global 404, it's using the global one, which is pretty cool. I saw a question there, I think. Oh, Alex is heading out. Thanks, Alex. All right.
Okay, so we
Oh,
have
yeah,
just about hit, we just about hit an hour, and I feel like we can do an official wrap up now, maybe. And if there's like other stuff we can keep going, but just give the folks a chance to like, you know.
Yeah,
So
that sounds good. Yeah, I didn't ever, I mean, you know, I was working on this up until like 2 minutes before we started. So apologies for running late. I didn't even get to like the really fun stuff. So maybe I could do a part 2 or something in a couple weeks.
I mean,
But
I'm totally good to keep going. And I don't know if the folks listening, like if everyone's cool to like keep going on, then that's perfectly fine. But if not, then I don't know. It's like, how do we want to do it? If you're okay to keep going, then we can totally, like if Putrick says he's good for more. So if folks are still good for more, then like that's absolutely fine. Dom's got to head out. So yeah.
well, let's see,
we do
does
a part
anybody that's here have some questions about what we've covered so far before we like wrap this up?
Yeah, probably a good time for any Q&A.
Another thing we could do is like stop the recording and start a new one or something. But yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Let's just stop now, and we can get into the rest of that's what we have. Yep, that's good. I got three
I like
more full sections, including obviously like making API requests and things like that. And that's where like Next.js like really starts firing on all cylinders. The routing stuff is very cool and I like it a lot. There are, you know, you see like similar stuff in a lot of other of these frameworks. Jeroen said Svelte-Kit's similar, and I believe him. Remix is similar, you know. The way they do things is a little different. Remix doesn't have server components right now. I assume that they're working on that, maybe. But yeah, it's pretty cool stuff, and I've really been enjoying it. I honestly found Next.js a pain with the pages router, and with this new router setup, I've been really enjoying it. So yeah, let's wrap up. Thank you for coming to part 1. uh, catch up. I think we have another one scheduled next week, so probably part 2 will be in 2 weeks, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so I mean, like, first of all, I sort of like really enjoyed this. I really appreciated the sort of at the beginning, or sort of like, well, hey, this is how we started, and then like like here was this was good, but what you couldn't do was, and we did this, and like this was good, but what you couldn't do was, it was like there's a nice like, how did we end up here? And yeah, like the really sort of like nice breakdown about the structure. And I did not know about the parens, like the way to like have grouping components without binding them to the routing pattern. And that when you showed, I'm like, oh yeah, that's like incredibly useful. And I probably should have thought that's like a thing that we had to do. Yeah, this has been really good. And I think knowing that this is now React sort of like de facto promoted, if you're gonna do it this way. This feels like super timely as well. So thank you again to everybody for coming. Thank you so much, Dan, for putting this together. I think we'll redrop a link to the site in the Slack so folks can like poke around at that on your own. It feels really good. It's just like a sample app of like all the little pieces. We want to just poke around, like get a feel for it. And yeah, we will figure out a good time to do a part 2 where we can get into like even more of the fun stuff. Because I don't know, at this point, it feels like if I'm going to be doing a React app, this is probably the way to go about it. So this feels very, very relevant.
yeah,
Yeah, and for everyone watching, again, thank you for coming out. We're going to keep the discussion for all this going in Slack. At some point, we will get this video up online on our YouTube channel, so you can view it there. And if you have any questions or comments, always feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for coming. Oh yeah, and as always, if you're watching this and you have an idea or a topic that you want to present in a similar fashion, you can always do that. We're always happy to facilitate people having these kinds of talks and sharing things with the community, because it's one of the things that makes this community awesome, and we really appreciate it. Yeah, have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.